I'm Jessica Minton for IBTimes TV, and I'm joined again by Nick Balletta, who's the CEO of TalkPoint, to talk about there's nothing neutral about net neutrality. Now, Nick, it's so great having you back with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, this recent ruling that the federal court struck down about net neutrality, can you break it down for me and talk about really what it means and how exactly it impacts the content business?
Well, this ruling from the court, which may be overturned at a higher court, basically said that the FCC characterization of ISPs as being common carriers isn't actually true. So that's a little confusing, but the reality is that a common carrier has to operate under FCC regulation as it relates to net neutrality, meaning any traffic that is transported over their network has to be treated equally and fairly. The fact that the FCC has said that they're not common carriers, now they can discriminate ISPs in terms of how they charge for different types of traffic being transported over their networks.
So basically, different internet service providers like AT&T, Verizon, they can basically control the speed of your internet if they want to.
Well, that, and also they can charge for different types of traffic that get transported over the internet. And mainly the two biggest targets right now are Netflix and Google. Google owning YouTube.
So what about Amazon and Hulu? Does that also affect them too?
It will, but I think the biggest ones right now are Google and the folks at Netflix, because they're commoditizing or commercializing their content that they're distributing over the network.
So if someone uses the internet for delivery, where exactly do they end up standing on the ruling?
Well, interesting. The net effect is that rates are going to go up, right? Because I think what's going to happen is if the ISPs charge Netflix a higher rate to transport their video data versus normal data on the internet, they're going to have to pass along those rate increases ultimately to their end users. So end users such as ourselves are going to see rate increases. Interesting enough, the same thing may happen with YouTube and with Google.
So who do you think is impacted most by net neutrality, and how are those issues now affecting consumers?
Well, any way you slice it, it's going to be the end consumer, because somebody has to pay. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the end user. Even if you look at it from a different perspective and say, what if Google says to Verizon that we're not going to pay the premium to have our YouTube, our content distributed over your network, and they say, we're actually going to shut down your users from getting to Google. Think about the battles that happen now between some of the cable companies and some of the local cable operators and some of the content providers. You could have a situation where every Verizon client and user goes to log into Google one day and a sign pops up and says, sorry, Verizon user, you can no longer get to Google because we're in a dispute with Verizon. Very similar to what happened in New York here with Time Warner Cable and Showtime. Over the summer, there was a couple of weeks where we couldn't get to Showtime because there was a battle between who paid what whom. That could ultimately happen on the internet as well.
So as of now, how exactly are broadband providers faring compared to content providers?
Well, in many cases, they're one and the same, right? But for the cable operators. But the reality is that you have access to the internet, and you have transport, and you have egress. But everyone pays to get on the internet. It's not as if Netflix doesn't pay for their bandwidth on the internet. It's just that they use an inordinate amount compared to the regular user. I even read a study that said on any given Saturday in the afternoon, 40 or 50% of the traffic traveling over Verizon's network is actually YouTube traffic. So they see that, and they see it being monetized by the folks at Google, and they want their piece of the pie.
And finally, when it comes to the ruling, where do you think it's headed now, and do you think the Supreme Court will end up taking it on?
I think they will. I think they're going to basically rule that these guys are common carriers, and net neutrality is going to be here to stay.
Well, Nick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.